All right, so going a little bit early here, but I just want to mention some things off the top. If you go to Files on Canvas and look under the practice problems data set, I put up, and I didn't say these are detailed answers like I did before, but these are the detailed answers, kind of how you would work through the problems, as well as kind of what the answer should be. It kind of goes up through perfectly competitive markets, understanding profit. So just some additional review questions. The exam's not for another, I think tentatively, I think the date was set November 4th or 5th, whatever that Friday is. So about 2 weeks from now. I might push that forward to class. We'll kind of see where we end up at the end of this week, although we're pretty much on track. So kind of leading up into that, I'll also get another set. I'll call it like practice problems 4. It'll basically be more questions over what we're going to cover this week, as well as a little bit last week with monopolies, and then kind of some of the other types of markets like oligopolies and monopolistically competitive. Okay. So you'll see that pop up on Canvas. The questions in that practice problem might not make a lot of sense right now, but hopefully by the end of the week, most of those will be something that we've talked about or seen in class. Okay. Also that I can get back here. That third homework is due by the end of the week. I'll likely get up another one even before this due date is passed, just for those of you, if you've started or you've finished number 3, although I think the last few questions will be stuff that we talk about today. So after today, you should be able to work through every single problem on that homework assignment, but I'll get the next one up there as well. So if you want to start working on that this week as we cover the material there, you can kind of start doing that as well. Okay. Any questions for me before we kind of get started here today? Just trying to get some of the housekeeping stuff out of the way. Okay. All right. Get this out of the way. So where did we leave off? Okay. So we were talking about monopolies, right? We had these perfectly competitive markets. We kind of had a pretty good understanding of how to calculate profits, kind of identify the optimal quantity. We said the rule is really the same for monopolies. It's just that they no longer face this kind of horizontal demand or marginal revenue curve because they're choosing the price, right? They're the only firm, so they're choosing the price. So based off of the fact that they're choosing the price and quantity, the marginal revenue curve they face is actually going to be downward sloping. And we said relative to demand, what's true about the slope of marginal revenue for monopolies? You remember twice as steep, right? So I know I can always kind of draw it like approximately twice as steep as demand. Okay. We then said the profit maximizing quantity still going to follow that same rule. So we think about kind of that profit maximizing quantity, even for a monopolist, it's going to be where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost at this quantity. How do they determine what price they're going to set? Well, if I'm supplying this much to the market, I know that consumers will be willing to pay up to however much they additionally benefit or what their marginal benefit is. Well, the demand curve tells me their marginal benefit. So at this quantity, I just go up the demand curve, and that's the price I can get away with charging for this product. Because I know at that quantity, consumers will be willing to pay up to wherever they're at in that demand curve or however much their marginal benefit is. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? So I think I've got some iClickers here. I'm not going to use them for iClicker, although as I say that, I realize I didn't start this, so I will use them later. I'm not using them right now. So, one thing that we said was in this monopolized market, what's going to end up being true? Well, if I look here, there you go. The price that the monopolist sets is going to be above the marginal revenue and the marginal cost. So at that profit maximizing quantity, the marginal revenue, marginal cost are the same, but both of those will be below the price the monopolist can charge. I think we did this at the very end of class on Friday. So that price is going to be above both the marginal cost and marginal revenue for a monopolist. Okay. If we wanted to look at this not visually on a graph, but we instead try to do this with some kind of tables that have price quantity combinations. First question we got here is, let's assume we've got an easier example. So we don't have increasing marginal cost here. I can try to give you a visualization that goes along with this. So let's say we've got demand, which reflects marginal benefit. We know marginal revenue for the firm or the monopolist will be twice as steep. And let's assume I've got this constant marginal cost. Okay. I'll do this occasionally to make some points just to simplify it, making marginal cost constant. In practice, we know that it's generally upward sloping, but this just helps kind of simplify it sometimes. Okay. We've got this marginal cost of $5 at every unit, right? We're looking for the quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So if I've got a marginal cost of 5 at every single unit, what would the profit maximizing quantity be here? Well, I could go ahead, even if I didn't give you that marginal revenue column, how do I calculate marginal revenue? Do we remember? How do I calculate the marginal of anything? So it's the change, right, in whatever I'm interested in. Here, I'm interested in revenue. So the change in total revenue divided by a change in what? Quantity, outputs. Here I don't have a nice neat example with 1 unit increases. I've got 5 unit increases. So for this first one, I go from 0 to 5. What's the marginal revenue of those first 5 units? Well, the change in revenue was 45, divided by the change in quantity of 5, I get 9. And then the next one, if I go to 10 units, total revenue is 80, old total revenue is 45. That difference is what? 35? 35 divided by change in quantity. So 5 to 10, the change in quantity was 5 again. So 35 divided by 5 is 7. And I kind of continue to do that. So I don't know why I kind of put this like in between, because it's kind of like the marginal revenue of moving in between these. You kind of think about like this would be like zero quantity, there is no marginal revenue, right? I'm not making no revenue if I sell 0. So you can kind of think about these values, like shift it down a little bit, but I kind of have them in between to kind of reflect that the way we're calculating them are the movements between these two. So I'm looking for where is marginal revenue for marginal cost. If my marginal cost is always 5, then I'm looking for where my marginal revenue is also 5. Well, where was that happening? When I was moving from 10 to 15 units, the jump here was what? 25. Change in total revenue is 25 divided by the change in quantity of 5. 25 over 5 is 5. So that 15th unit, I'd be hitting that point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Right? So if I'm thinking about graphing this out here, I had this constant marginal cost at $5. That 15th unit is going to be where profits were maximized. And basically that makes sense because every unit here, the marginal revenue was greater than the marginal cost. So I was adding more revenue than I was my cost or increasing my profits. In a weird way, you can kind of think, I usually don't write this, but like marginal profits are really just the difference between marginal revenues and marginal costs. So as long as that's positive, I'm increasing my profit. Up to that point where I'm indifferent, exactly, those are the exact same value. Let's say instead, I had a constant price of $0 per unit. It's kind of a weird one. Where would what would be the profit maximizing quantity if I somehow had 0 marginal costs? Okay. So not quite infinity. Remember, we said that even at 0 costs, let's say I had 0 marginal costs here, where would my optimal quantity be? Still, where marginal cost, it's marginal revenue. If you think about it, even when marginal costs are 0, in order to increase profits, my marginal revenue has to be positive. And we never see this in practice because firms don't choose to do it. But if they wanted to, if they kind of kept on increasing quantity, at some point, they will get negative additional revenue, right? So we know they would never choose to be here, you know, even if the cost was 0, like you have to be like getting paid to produce down here, right? There's no, otherwise we won't do it. We always have costs, never even have 0 costs. So it's not like someone's going to pay you to make something. Well, We'll talk about subsidies later on today, but yeah. So we're looking for what's the last quantity where we had positive marginal revenue. This very last kind of movement, going from 25 to 30, notice total revenue went down. So we wouldn't choose to produce those, go from 25 to 30 units because that marginal revenue is negative. It would be below the marginal cost of zero. So the very last unit that we kind of supply that 25th one, it still has a positive marginal revenue. Questions on that? Just to kind of recap, you remember what I said about when marginal revenue is negative? That tells us that we're on a certain portion of the demand curve. Yeah, remember the inelastic portion of the demand curve is kind of down here in the bottom. So this kind of makes sense. Like I'm producing more, a higher quantity, but that comes at a trade-off of I have to charge a lower price. Well, if it's inelastic, right, that means that people aren't being very responsive to price changes. So that reduction in price is having a huge impact on my profits, but I'm not gaining near as much in terms of a percent change in quantity, right? People aren't buying a whole lot more in response to the price change. So that increase in quantity doesn't increase my profits, and we end up seeing the kind of profits end up being negative, but also marginal revenue is negative. So when marginal revenue is negative from an inelastic portion of the demand curve, we know that firms will never choose to be there, even if marginal cost is zero, which isn't very practical. There's going to be some cost of producing something. And then up here, we said we're on the elastic portion, which is where monopolists are going to choose to produce somewhere in that range. So this is a little bit tricky. I don't think I have a slide here. So let's go back to this one. So I choose that profit maximizing quantity of 15 units. From a table like this, what would be the price that this monopolist would charge? Now, visually, you know that you go up to the demand curve and figure out what that price is that the monopolist would charge. But how would I do that using the output? So if I know the profit maximizing quantity is 15, these price quantity combinations are essentially what gives me that demand curve. These are the different quantities purchased for these different prices. So those prices essentially tell me where I'd be at on my demand curve at those different quantities. So if I choose the profit maximizing quantity of 15, the price I can get away with setting is 7. So I'm kind of graphing it out to kind of match up with this. We get the price that the monopolist kind of charges is 7, which is above their marginal cost, right? Or above their marginal revenue as well. Any questions on this? We'll look at this a couple different ways. I alluded to this at the end of class as well. So we've got a perfectly competitive market. We know that the equilibrium quantity should be where supply is equal to demand. Right now, supply is not from one firm, it's from several firms. Our equilibrium price will be at that same point as well. And firms would take that price as given, making their kind of this, making their production decision or output decision. But for the monopolists, right, they face the entire demand curve and they're the only supplier, right? So they're choosing this price quantity combination, whatever their marginal cost is, that's essentially supply. And then they don't choose the equilibrium point where supply is equal to demand. They're profit maximizing. They don't care about society. They don't care about total surplus for everyone. They care about their total surplus, right? Or their profits. So they're going to set the optimal quantity with marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, right? Which relative to the perfectly competitive quantity and price, lower quantity, and then the price. I think we alluded to at the end of last class, this creates some dead weight loss, right? So this is bad for society, but good for the company. Right? So I think about it now, producing less. So we're producing less, but selling at a higher cost. I kind of covered this at the end of Friday. What do I want to do here? I kind of want to, I've got it summarized here. So this is kind of just some general rules that we'll always remember. You can draw the graph to remind ourselves, but we're going to have a lower quantity than the perfectly competitive point. We're going to have a higher price. So the next thing, if I remember right, we'll do profits first. Going to do surplus, but we'll hold off on that. So this is where we kind of left off here. Probably we talked about these price quantities. Let's think about now, just like for perfectly competitive firms, we can actually calculate profits. And it's going to be the exact same equation. Right? So the quantity of the units we're selling times the difference between our average kind of per unit revenue, right, or the price, and our average cost, average total cost. So what that's going to look like usually is something like this. So we've got our demand curve, twice the steep marginal revenue curve, a more realistic increasing marginal cost curve, and then the same sort of rules apply to monopolists that do for perfectly competitive firms, in the sense that marginal cost will intersect their average total cost curve right at its minimum point. Okay, so nothing changes there. Because it's the same kind of cost rules that apply to perfectly competitive firms. It's going to hit that average total cost right at its minimum point. So where's the profit maximizing quantity? It's still going to be, I think I had it over there still. Where does marginal cost equal marginal revenue? Probably get tired of me saying that, right? We need to have that kind of hammered into our brain going into this next exam. So that profit maximizing quantity is where marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. Then at that quantity, we go up to the demand curve, figure out what the price the monopolist can charge is. And I'm just kind of shorthanding it. I don't have to represent a monopolist here. Well, what's profits? It's just the quantity that I'm selling times the difference between price and average total cost at that quantity. Where's my average total cost here? Right there. So I can see here, price is above my average total cost. Here, profits would be positive. Right? Or I can think about profits are positive. Questions on that? Add more to this. I'm seeing some different colors. I'm trying to make a point on the same graph. So we can see, frankly, I'm going to need some colors. So where would the perfectly competitive kind of equilibrium be in this market? Well, we said those follow the rules that we had way back, just identifying equilibriums, which is where does supply equal demand? Well, remember, the only supplier we have is the monopolist. So their marginal cost curve, essentially, we said supply represents marginal cost, but usually it represents the marginal cost of all these individual firms, supply waivers, supply curves, or supply equations. You've got one firm. So the monopolist marginal cost curve essentially is supply. So where would supply equal demand? Where the monopolist marginal cost curve hits the demand curve, there, I'll call this kind of TC, or the perfectly competitive equilibrium price. And then kind of running out of room here, but and this was average cost. So we can see that the price the monopolist charges a little bit higher, and they don't sell as many units to the market. They don't provide as many units to the market. And we know that actually for the monopolist won't be the profit maximizing point, because you'll notice the equilibrium couldn't be at a point where marginal revenue is negative. So it's best for society to end up at this equilibrium point where total surplus is maximized is not the best thing for the monopolist, right? They can actually generate more profits by restricting the quantity and setting a higher price. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep going here? Got one more thing I'm going to add to the graph. Hopefully it doesn't confuse you too much. So we got positive profits here, right? What if, I gotta try to draw this right. There we go. What if my average total cost, plot 2, is much higher? You know, for whatever, it's fixed cost in this industry go up, and so I got this average total cost curve dips up. Well, now what's going to happen? Profit maximizing quantity is still, when marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, I can still only get away with charging whatever price where I'd be up on that demand curve at that quantity. But now that price is significantly below my average total costs. So here profits would be negative. What happens if profits are negative? I've got a monopolist. Profits are negative, we'll say firms typically exit. There's only one firm, so when the monopolist leaves, this good doesn't get provided to the market. All right. Now, does that often happen? Occasionally, you kind of think about even if I had a monopoly on the market of typewriters, right? Like at some, well, I guess people still produce it. What's something that no wasp? I don't think they still make. I don't know. So walking in with a CD or a paper. Probably not. You guys do that. So you used to have to like hold on to a thing and then have a cord running up with your earphones, right? So I don't think they sell them. At some point, I'm sure Sony was close to monopoly in providing that. Like there was, you know, probably a major player. At some point, the demand curve starts shifting down for those products. You might end up with demand being below average total cost, and then you just see nobody provide that product. So it definitely happens in practice. But generally, we're looking at a market because something's being sold in that market, so we don't often kind of talk about it. All right, so I think I've got kind of another visualization slide for this, but I also think it's kind of helpful to kind of build this out and how you would draw for yourself and working on these problems. So, you know, everything that we've said here, the visual area of where profits is going to be. If we think about it, the two components of my profit equation, the quantity the firm is selling and the difference between price and average total cost. Quantity is just going to be the width of my rectangle. The height of that profit rectangle, well, that was just the difference between the price and the average total cost. So that's why we kind of know that that rectangle represents profits. It's not so much that like that it has to represent profits as it's that rectangle. In fact, if you didn't have linear demand curves, it wouldn't be exactly a rectangle, but it would still follow the same idea where you're just taking the number of units you're selling, multiplying it by that difference between price and average total cost. Difference between price and average total cost, we can kind of think about that as my per unit profit. So visually, it's going to look like a rectangle on a graph, but the height and the width of that rectangle match up to a profit equation. So you got a little bit of time working with the people around you. I'll ask you a couple questions. I want to kind of get a gauge of where we're at with this. My influence, what I do on Wednesday. So let's say you've got a market and you know that it is monopolized or that there is one producer. Okay. So you've got their marginal cost, you've got their average total cost curve, which you may not need for this question. You also have their demand and marginal revenue curves. Okay. So talk to the people around you. Hopefully shouldn't take too long. What's the optimal quantity for this monopolist to choose to maximize profits? The right side of the board might help you remember how you find that optimal quantity. Also, be helpful. Black six all represent increases of 5. Okay, so not like 10, 15, 20. Excuse me. All right. If you haven't gotten an answer in, kind of take your best guess here, and we'll talk about it. Got 38 of us here today. Buddy, good. All right, 41. Okay, close this out. So, what should the answer be here? Why? So that would be the quantity where a perfectly competitive market would result, right? Perfectly competitive equilibrium would be where marginal cost or supply curve is demand. We want the optimal quantity for the monopolist, right? So I said, what's on the right side of the board here that might help you remember where they choose that quantity at. Where marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost of that last unit provided. So the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost right here is actually at the 15. Okay? The perfectly competitive, we sometimes compare to that point. That's the point where total surplus will be maximized for society. The monopolist doesn't give two rips about that, right? Because all they care about is their own profits. Their profits are maximized at the quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? All right. So I won't give you quite as much time on this one. Should be hopefully pretty quick. What we now know the optimal quantity is that 15th unit. What price will the monopolist set? Okay. So we already identified the equilibrium or the profit maximizing quantity. At that profit maximizing quantity, what price will it set? Yeah. Oh, I'll hold off until once I close it out. Okay. Breaking even. So, do you have a question over like what the graph is or what values they are?
I mean, I know which left side it's going to be the price, right? So, like,
yeah. So these jumps are all five. Okay, well, we'll talk about it in a second. All right, if you haven't gotten an answer in, take your best guess here. Thought we had 41 before, so make sure. All right, closing it out. So what price should they be able to charge here? Well, we know that the optimal quantity is 15, right? What can I get away with setting the price at? However much people are additionally benefiting with the anchor. They go all the way up here. They'll set that price at 35. Okay. I think what you were asking.
yeah.
So remember, what we're identifying are the profit maximizing quantity price, right? So I'll go up there. Maybe I'll get the answer up here. So before I go to this next point. So we go up to that demand curve. The price should be 35 to maximize profits. Where would profits be 0? Yeah, if we're at that quantity of 15, where we're at on that average total cost curve, 25. That would be like our break-even price, right? We want the profit maximizing price. Break-even means profits are 0. So that's, we want to go a little bit higher. But you're thinking about things correctly. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So what's 20?
What's 20?
The intersection of revenue and cost. What is that revenue and cost?
So what this is telling me is that last unit I sold, the additional revenue and additional cost for this thing, right? I was going to help that quantity. What is it telling us? Nothing entirely useful. I mean, it's allowing us to identify that profit maximizing quantity, but from there, it doesn't tell us necessarily anything about the price other than I know that the price, because marginal revenue is always underneath my demand curve, price is steep. I know that whatever my marginal revenue is, the price has to be higher. So I guess if you want to think about it, if I can identify where marginal revenue hits marginal cost, I know the price has to be above that value. So here, that's going to help me know that it has to be serious. Is that? Yes, that's actually a question. Any other questions here? So I'll make I don't think I think I have the profit amount, but I don't want to ask this, but I'll kind of show you, walk you through this. Once you understand how we calculate this profit, I will give you one more piece of information here that helps us think about these. We got this up here. I just want to draw this out to maybe feel it more. So we've got quantity, got my demand curve, got my twice as steep marginal revenue curve. I've got marginal costs, right? We just identified the optimal quantity was 15. The price that we charge was the price for the monopolist was 35, right? So how would I calculate profits? Well, profits are going to be the quantity I sell times the difference between price and average total cost. So if I'm looking here, my average total cost curve, at that profit maximizing quantity, I kind of already said what's my break-even price, or where am I at my average total cost curve? I was at 25, right? So the point that I'm at on my average total cost curve is 25 there. Well, here's like my quantity, right? It's 15 minus 0. That's my optimal quantity. I can plug that into my profit equation. Right? So 15 is my optimal quantity. Times the difference between my price and my average total cost. Well, the price we said was 35. The point we're at that quantity of 15 on my average total cost is 25. And we ended up getting our profit level of $150. Okay. Any questions on kind of any of those numbers I grabbed? We're just kind of taking the two things we've already identified. The only other piece of information we needed was what is average total cost at that quantity. Once we had that, it's a matter of getting plugged into that profit equation. But I think it's still, yeah, it's over there on the left-hand side. I want to make one more point here. This is like my monopolist profits. If this market was a perfectly competitive market, so now, as I mentioned earlier, supply represents marginal cost. So my supply and demand curve would hit right at that point. I can kind of think about, here's my perfectly competitive pricing quantity. You'll notice, right, I am selling more units, but try to draw this visually. You kind of see my profits are probably quite a bit smaller, right? This area that represents profits, which is, I try to draw this so that it was exactly at 25 on both points, right? Well, my price is now lower, right? So it kind of closes the gap in profits. If I, in fact, use this up here, that price on a perfectly competitive market would be 27.5. The average total cost would be 25. So the difference between price and average total cost for the perfectly competitive firm would only be 250 times the number of units they sell. 250 times 22.5. That value ends up being lower than the monopolist profits, right? So I don't know if anybody wants to help me on this. So we had what? Profit maximizer, sorry, perfectly competitive firm would be at, actually, am I doing that right? Is that 20? Yeah, it is at 22.5, my bad. At a quantity of 22.5, right? And the price would be 27.5. Right? So the difference between price and average total cost, well, what is my average total cost at this perfectly competitive perfectly competitive equilibrium? Average total cost is 25. I don't know what this number exactly ends up being, something a little bit over 50, I'm thinking. But that's significantly lower than 150. We have a calculator and all of this. So you can see that if this market was operating as a perfectly competitive market, profits would be much lower for the firm than if they behave as a monopolist, right? Almost triple their profits there. Okay. Any questions before we keep moving? So, time. All right. I'll use this example where we have constant marginal cost to prove an extreme point. Okay? So now that we can kind of think about profits for the perfectly competitive and the monopolist, the perfectly competitive firm and the monopolist, I then want to start thinking about surplus. So I think I got a couple of people, I think, in the last exam. There's a little bit of a confusion. So we can talk about a surplus in quantity, right? Having more units supplied than we do demanded. But when I say use the term of total surplus, we're talking about some measure of how much consumers and producers are benefiting, right? So that was identifying like the triangle, right? The area under the demand curve but above the equilibrium price, and then the area below the equilibrium price but above my supply curve, right? To identify consumer and producer surplus, adding them together to give you total. So let's think about this unique kind of case where we typically do have increasing marginal costs, but I tried to find an example where marginal costs are pretty constant and they're relatively low. So if you think of like generic drugs, the R&D that went into this drug was like a huge fixed cost. But the marginal cost, once you have it, you know the drug works, it costs the exact same amount to produce every single pill, and you're just operating this huge production. The marginal cost is the same for every pill, and it's relatively low. Like people aren't hand packing the pills, right? It's all machinery, so you don't have to worry about hiring more labor or anything like that. It's just how many can I turn out, and whatever that drug costs me, like the raw material, that's just my marginal cost. So it's not always going to be this easy, but there are practical applications for having this constant marginal cost. So let's think about this scenario first, where we've got a perfectly competitive market. Where's the equilibrium quantity going to be? Well, my supply curve reflects marginal cost here, so I'd actually end up at this quantity. What's the equilibrium price? Well, at this point, my demand curve, so it ends up being exactly what marginal cost is. In a perfectly competitive market, if I've got several generic drugs, they all do the same thing. Am I going to, let's say, I don't put a name to them, but if it's like they're all $3, like that, I don't know. You guys are young, hopefully a lot healthier, but if you get older, you have to, you'll go to the pharmacist more. Like, so if you're going and like, you gotta get some generic, like, antibiotic. There's 5 companies that make it. Which one are you going to choose? It's all literally the exact same thing. In fact, this makes me upset. But like, if you look, the other thing that drives, I don't understand people, but if you go to buy like Tylenol, the generic version of Tylenol, turn around. The ingredient, it's literally the same thing. So you're just paying for the brand name Tylenol as opposed to buying, great value Tylenol or whatever it is, So generic drugs, same idea. Nobody has any influence over the price, right? So we get these really low marginal costs, but the price is exactly what it's costing them, right? And we generally end up with like one provider of this generic drug. So you can't really compete. Right? I mean, you're going to drive the profits down the street. So anyways, so here, what's producer surplus? Really weird. What's the area above my supply curve up to my equilibrium price? Producer surplus is actually 0. What area represents my consumer surplus? Will be the entire area under my demand curve and above the equilibrium price. So you kind of think about here, here's my consumer surplus when it's marketed in perfect competition or the perfectly competitive market. Problem is, just describe a scenario where there's usually only one provider of these generic drugs because there's no profit in there. So if I instead of having like a generic drug, I had someone who had like patent rights and was a monopolist, right? So now we're moving from like generic drugs and thinking about, here's the firm, they put all this R&D to it, they have the patent for this drug, they're the only one that can produce it and sell it for the next, I don't know how long patents last, but 20 years or something. Where's the profit maximizing quantity now going to be? For the monopolist, it's going to be at a lower quantity. The price they're going to charge for this drug is going to be much higher. Let's think about what's happened to surplus in this extreme situation where we started out with no producer surplus and a lot of consumer surplus. I'm going to need a red mark somewhere. So now where is producer and consumer surplus? Well, now consumer surplus, the area under my demand curve, but above the equilibrium price, which the equilibrium price is now the price the monopolist is setting. Notice consumer surplus under a monopolist much lower. I went from this entire blue triangle to this little green one up here. Where's producer surplus? The area below the price that they can charge down to the supply curve. So here we have this kind of constant supply curve. So it's a nice, easy example where now this entire red area, no, sorry, monopolist, right? Producer surplus for the monopolist significantly higher than under a perfectly competitive market. So these monopolized markets, what happens is, if you think about, we start out with this entire blue area, you could take all of consumer surplus, right? You're decreasing it as a monopolist and turning a large majority of it into producer surplus, right? Which essentially kind of, it's easier to think about representing profits, right? So that's why we don't like monopolized markets. It hurts consumers a lot. They pay higher prices, their surplus is reduced, but also, this is like a really, I don't know, I think with drugs, there's some regulatory stuff that prevents this from happening. But if there was no government regulation, what's also happened, the number of units provided in the market has went down. So now all of this, it was blue before, that was blue before. We're no longer selling these units. So now we also, as a result of this monopolist, have a huge deadly loss in society as well. So society is hurt, primarily consumers, and then the producers are kind of taking some of what used to be consumer surplus, converting it into profit to producer surplus. Questions over anything? I know using different colors is a little bit tricky. I'm trying to kind of give you a good visualization of what we see happening once the market is monopolized. So we kind of already walked through this. But you can imagine, you know, for generic drugs versus someone with a patent right, the monopolist charges a much higher price, provides less in the market, which we're talking about drugs. If there was no regulatory agency, like, this is a bad thing. Like, these drugs are probably something that could really help people out in life, right? And if we just see fewer of them provided to the market, that means there's fewer people out there who are able to find a benefit from having this drug. Yeah. I'm not saying patents are like a terrible thing, but they have their uses, but that is one kind of negative effect. Okay. So I kind of already went through this on the board, just another visualization though. When you think about starting from this perfectly competitive point, we have this price and kind of quantity we get to, where supply equals demand, we would have this deadweight loss once it's monopolized, where the monopoly sets a higher price, lower quantity, we end up with a loss to society. Questions? Go through this quick. This is just a more practical version of what we kind of worked through up here on the board, where I kept marginal cost constant. You have the same thing, it just be a little bit more difficult to identify producer and consumer surplus. Actually, the same more difficult might be easier because it was kind of hard to envision that producer surplus was zero here with a constant marginal cost. It generally starts out, if we had something that looks more like this, right? There's going to be producer surplus originally, there's going to be consumer surplus originally. After that market is monopolized, I can imagine consumer surplus is now a much smaller triangle. Producers kind of pick up this surplus in the middle from consumers, and then we have that result in deadweight loss. So kind of the visualization of what new producer surplus would be, maybe a little bit harder to calculate, right? Because it's going to be the area below the price the monopolist sets, but above the supply curve. So I now am going to have like a triangle and a rectangle that I would have to use to calculate what total surplus is. Right? I mean, if I had like this on a grid line, it's not too much, you know, it's not a whole lot of additional work. But I now have to, instead of on the area of just a triangle, I've got to find the area of a triangle and a rectangle. So we already talked about this, but the result is then after this market is monopolized, we see lower consumer surplus once again, same kind of way we were computing it when we had markets that were pretty competitive, just the area in between the demand curve and the equilibrium price, or in this case, the price the monopolist is setting. And then what is deadweight loss? It's that area in between my supply and my demand curve, which remember, the marginal cost of the monopolist space, that is my supply curve. They're the only firm. So the difference in between my supply curve and my demand curve, for all the units that I'm no longer selling, that would represent my deadweight loss. Questions here? Five minutes. What do I want to do these last 5 minutes? I think we'll maybe go through some of this at the beginning of the next class to kind of do a review. But I did want to point one thing out. And I kind of already alluded to it earlier, but it's something that we'll investigate a little bit further next class. But sometimes we have these things called natural monopolies, right? So I'm talking about like market getting monopolized, right? Well, how does that happen? Sometimes it's a result of what I've got my demand, the marginal revenue curve, say marginal cost is right here. Here's my average total cost, okay? So identify that equilibrium quantity for the monopolist. Here's their equilibrium price. Well, that's above average total cost. So everything's great. Profits are positive. Okay. Well, what happens if profits are positive in industry? Firms like to, well, profits are positive, firms like to enter that market. As soon as we have two firms, an easy way to think about this is I was facing the entire demand curve now. If we're producing the same product, demand is going to be divided into two, right? So if demand is cut in half, it could be the case that now, even if we're still both acting like monopolists, this new, I call it two, quantity and this new price way below where I'm at in my average total cost curve, right? So this would be an example where as soon as one other firm enters this industry and we have to split demand, there's not enough demand for us both to be profitable, right? Profits are negative here. What happens if profits are negative? A firm would exit, we're left with one firm again. We would call that a natural monopoly. A market where there's only enough demand to support one firm. As soon as a second firm enters, whatever the costs of that providing that product are, just results in the fact that if I have to share demand with another company, our profits will both be negative, one of us will be. Now in practice, people probably don't join because they project that there's not enough demand and so they never end up joining anyways, but that would be kind of the idea of a natural monopoly. So we'll work through a few more problems at the beginning of the next class. We'll kind of handle this natural monopoly, how we regulate monopolies, and then we'll probably transition to thinking about monopolistically competitive markets. Okay? All right, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.